morning, and welcome to today's virtual event. My name is Will Wexler, and I'm Director of the Rafiq Hariri Center and Middle East Programs here at the Atlantic Council. The topic of today's discussion is one that I think is really interesting and important. It's Russia's influence on the Mediterranean and the surrounding region. For more than 2 centuries, Russian leaders have sought to project power and influence into the Mediterranean region. Sometimes these efforts have met with a significant degree of success. Other times in history, Russia has pulled back from the Mediterranean because of setbacks or events in Europe or events internally inside of Russia. But this ebb and flow we've seen over the centuries, and these pullbacks have never been permanent and have always been followed by renewed Russian efforts to gain influence in the region. During today's event, we'll touch upon Russian President Vladimir Putin's successes and his broader objectives in the Mediterranean, the factors that have helped and hinders Putin's achievement of these objectives, why the United States might be concerned about these, and what we should do about growing Russian influence in the Mediterranean. Our non-resident senior fellow, Mark Katz, joins us here today to present the findings of his latest issue brief, Putin's Mediterranean Gambit, Endgame Unclear, published on our website just last month. This issue brief comes at a very timely moment, and I highly recommend it to all of you here today. But before we go to Mark, I want to introduce our panelists. I invite you to read their full bios on our event page on our website. But just briefly, Laura Cooper, a former colleague of mine at the Pentagon, is currently serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. She's a career member of the Senior Executive Service, one of the real stars of the Pentagon. She has responsibility for policy concerning Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia, Western Balkans, as well as conventional arms control. Ms. Cooper previously served as a principal director in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Global Security Affairs. We also have Chris Bort with us, who since 2017 has served as the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia on the National Intelligence Council. The NIC, of course, is the Center for Long-Term and Strategic Analysis within the intelligence community. This is Chris's second tour at the NIC. He's been a specialist on Eurasia in a variety of roles for the intelligence community ever since 1981. And as I mentioned before, Mark Katz, a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council, is also professor of government and politics at the George Mason University Schar School of Policy and Government. When I hand it over to Mark and he begins the discussion, after which there will be a question and answer session. Please write in your questions in using the Q&A function in the Zoom at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll answer as many questions as possible. It'd be very helpful for you also to identify yourself. Please, as always, check out the things that we write and we publish on our website at atlanticcouncil.org, and please follow us on Twitter at AC Mideast. I'll now give the floor to Mark.
Thanks, Will. Thank you so very much. It's a great honor to be here today with such distinguished panelists. And just wanted to say before turning to the discussion that obviously, we're all concerned about what Russia's doing in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, but they're obviously also involved in the Mediterranean region, involved in 2 conflicts, Syria, Libya. But just throughout the region, one of the interesting things is that they are very involved everywhere and working with every government in the region. And one of the challenges, I think, for the U.S. is the fact that virtually every American ally in the region cooperates with Russia to some extent. And this makes it a little bit more challenging in terms of how we deal with this. Anyway, let me start with a question. Let me first turn to Chris. Chris, do you see Russia as having an overall strategy toward the Mediterranean region? One strategy for the European side, another for the Middle Eastern side, or several ad hoc strategies toward individual countries and conflicts?
Thanks, Mark. I would say that Russia does have different strategies for different parts of the region. This is kind of part and parcel of the way it's envisioned its role in this part of the world. The main thing for Russia is to be the indispensable player in the Mediterranean, just as in any other part of the world where it started to move. So the states that border the northern part of the Mediterranean have a different importance to Russia than do the states on the southern rim. One thing that I wanted to say as we think about this is that we have had we've been burdened by assumptions about what Russia was capable of and what Russia wanted to do. So for years after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and well into the presidency of Putin's presidency, we assumed that Russia did not see it in its interest to spread its influence into this part of the world. Russia had withdrawn from the Eastern Mediterranean and from the Middle East very soon after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And we lived with the assumptions for years that, Russia's approach to the countries of the region was largely commercially driven. Russia was not going to get involved in the conflicts in the Middle East. Recall that soon after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Middle East peace process, the quadripartite Middle East peace process, Russia was invited to join, but it was not seen as a serious player. If you recall Clinton, under the Clinton administration, Russia was invited in almost as a gift. So that was the approach that we ascribed to Russia. We didn't assume that it wanted to be a big player there. So now it's back. It's back for a few different reasons. It needs to continue what it started in Syria. Now that it's decided that reemerging as a global player is like the most important thing for Vladimir Putin, it's reasserted itself in Syria. So the renaissance of its status as a global great power and all that, it's need to be seen as indispensable in any resolution to the world's crises, and its need to limit the influence of the US. That's its main goal in Syria, and that's its main goal for the Middle East writ large. Its second goal really is to confront attempts at color revolutions. Russia feels like it needs to undo the popular revolts that it sees as supported by the West against sovereign dictators, all under the pretext of fighting terrorism and restoring statehood. So this was key to its decision to move into Syria, and it defines its position towards those states in the Eastern Mediterranean, largely along the northern rim of Middle East, North Africa, the part that you were asking about. That does not, that is not its goal as much in, the northern part, the northern rim of the Mediterranean. But, except for, if you're talking about the Western Balkans. So confronting attempts at color revolutions, undoing the popular revolts in Egypt, it was a key moment for Russia in Egypt when it stood up for Hosni Mubarak and the undoing of the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi's government there. And then Russia's third goal is to restore Russia's historic network of client states. And in this sense, this applies more to the countries like Egypt and Syria, to use this influence also to advance its commercial interest, to monetize Russia's military and counterterrorism so-called services, in the form of military bases, beneficial contracts for the purchase of Russian weapons, acquisition of valuable natural resources, and construction of logistical infrastructure. So that is the flag that Russia's planting, and it does distinguish between the southern coast of the Mediterranean, the eastern coast, and we could talk at length about Turkey and Russia's relations with Turkey, but I'll stop right there for now.
Thank you so very much. Turning to Laura, in light of all this, what Chris said, Russia has obviously lots of different goals in the region. But asking you, what policies is the Biden administration pursuing in response to Russian actions in the Mediterranean region?
Thank you so much. And just at the outset, I want to thank the Atlantic Council, and I want to thank you, Mark, for inviting me. I truly enjoyed reading your paper, and I think this is an incredibly important topic for us here in the Defense Department and really across the Biden administration today. Talking about how we are framing our response to Russia, I would start with kind of a broader framing, and then narrow it in a bit to the specifics of the Mediterranean region. But I think it's important to first start with a couple of key principles that I see this administration continually going back to. And the first is the essential importance of alliances and partnerships. I was really honored on Secretary Austin's very first day in office to witness him placing his first international phone call, and it was to NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. I think this one act, this one gesture is profoundly symbolic of how the administration is viewing the essential importance of alliances, and specifically NATO. When you look at the Mediterranean, obviously we have to look at the growing Russian military capability in the region, and we have to view that through a NATO lens. As I oftentimes say to NATO colleagues, the threat from the South increasingly is the threat from the East. So NATO is really an important part of this equation, but so are all of our partnerships. The way that the U.S. is approaching security cooperation is through developing very long-term strategic partnerships that involve training and education and operations that we work on together. And this approach is quite fundamental to all of the allies and partners of the region. But then on the flip side, I think you do have to look at Russia specifically. In the Mediterranean, we have plenty of issues that don't relate to Russia, but specific to Russia, we are determined to impose costs for Russia's destabilizing behavior. And this means, the administration rolled out a series of responses to everything from election interference and the use of nerve agent to poison Alexei Navalny, to solar winds, intrusions. So these are examples of how the Biden administration is going to decisively act when Russia commits acts that are destabilizing in the international community. Now, taking it into the Mediterranean more specifically, I want to pick up on another theme that President Biden has been very clear on. And this is that we are not seeking to escalate, and we are seeking to have a more stable relationship with Russia. So this inevitably involves dialogue. This is why President Biden has been open to speaking with President Putin. And this is why, on the host of challenges in the region, the way that the U.S. is looking at competition is not zero sum. And we do welcome the fact that in Libya, say, you see Russia actually providing this support for the government of national unity. But now is the time to watch and hold Russia to account. There is this agreement to remove foreign forces from Libya, so we will be watching closely to see if that actually occurs. I think I'll close on on a very specific note to Libya that, again, I think is emblematic of our larger approach. It's to attribute Russia's destabilizing actions where we see them, to shine a light on what Russia is doing. And I think AFRICOM, US AFRICOM, has really done an outstanding job here in shining a light on the range of equipment that Russia has brought into Libya, the dealings of the Wagner Group in Libya, and this is emblematic of this larger approach to how we address the Russia challenge. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Turning back to Chris, although the U.S.-Russian tensions have been increasing, what's so interesting to me is that most of America's allies in the Mediterranean cooperate with Russia to a greater or lesser extent. Why is this?
Yeah, and by the way, I wanted to say, Mark, I did like your paper too. I just like Laura, I read the whole thing, and unusually, I didn't find anything really there to disagree with. So I do recommend everyone to read that, and it does capture the full range of what Russia's trying to do. Yeah, no, why Russia can work with everyone and seemingly punch above its weight. It comes down to one thing. In my view, it's Russia deals in interests. It doesn't deal in values. And this has been something that has been a coin of its policy in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean that's really been a winner. And I mentioned Turkey before, you can just take Turkey as a perfect example. Here's a country where Russia and Turkey are practically at war on three different fronts, in Libya, Syria, and Nagorno-Karabakh. And yet somehow the two presidents have an understanding. It's nothing personal. Now, if one or the other were to violate potentially their personal understandings, then things can get quite messy, as we saw in 2015 with the shoot down of the Su-24 near Syria. But the two understand, that if Turkey is, for instance, happens to have interest in Nagorno-Karabakh because of its alliance with Azerbaijan, the two can talk that out and not come to worse blows over that. Now, sometimes Russia will, if its vis-a-vis goes too far, then perhaps Russia will pull a string, as for instance, when Erdogan met with Volodymyr Zelensky and supported the Crimea platform, suddenly the Russians decided that Turkey was a no-go zone for Russian tourists. So Russia sends a message that way, no, it's nothing personal, it's all about COVID. So dealing in interests has helped Russia, work its influence especially in Syria, where it has deliberately made itself the partner who can talk to all sides. It has no problem dealing with Israel in the morning and Iran in the afternoon, and having understandings with this side and that side. It can talk to the Kurds while it's trying to get the Kurds to be part of Bashar Assad's larger Syria project, while it's still talking to Turkey. So this is Russia's coin, and far from dismissing it, I think many of us have been surprised at how far Russia has been able to use this ability to be seen as an indispensable player. A lot of people point out, and not incorrectly, that this doesn't mean Russia can bring solutions to the region. I don't think Russia posits as its goal the need to bring a solution. It just needs to be the indispensable player, and can probably tell its vis-a-vis that other great powers haven't brought solutions either. But at least Russia has and can project the reputation of being indispensable, as being able to talk to all sides, And for now, that's probably enough. So I think that's a long-winded answer to your question, Mark.
Great, thank you. Turning back to Laura, to what extent is the cooperation between America's Mediterranean allies and Russia a problem for U.S. security interests, and what should the U.S. do about it?
Thank you. I actually think that Chris provided a really good backdrop to this question, because certainly Russia is very active in this sort of transactional mode of behavior with regimes, with countries across the region, allies, partners, adversaries. If you look at Iran and the growing Russian relationship with Iran, but I think from a policy perspective, we have to be measured and realistic about the actual impact of those transactional relationships. Russia's grand diplomacy to try to play the role of peacemaker isn't really fooling anyone. I think countries in the region recognize how much this is to burnish Russia's image, and how in many cases, prolonging instability, prolonging conflict actually suits Moscow's goals. So I think we have to give some credit to our allies and partners and their ability to be clear-eyed. There is such an inherent tension between Russia's desire to support a relationship with Iran and at the same time to cozy up to Arab countries and Israel at the same time. This inherent tension is not lost on any of the parties in the region. And so I think that's really important at the outset. We don't want to overhype the influence or overhype the threat. That said, we're really clear in our conversations with allies and partners about situations in which Russia's military-to-military cooperation in particular does impact our relationship. And I think, Chris already cited it, but the Turkey example is the best one to cite here, because it resulted in such a clear and decisive action on the part of the United States, removing Turkey from the F-35 program as a consequence of Turkey's refusal to give up the S-400 system. So there are limits. We are clear with allies and partners on those limits, but it's always a very case-by-case basis, because what Russia wants out of a given situation and what an ally or a partner might be willing to entertain is different depending on each case.
Very good, thank you. Turning back to Chris, in my Atlantic Council issue brief, I argue that while Russian influence has been growing in the Mediterranean, there are also limitations on what Russia can accomplish there. And to what extent do you share this view?
Yeah, I do share that view, Mark, and sort of mentioned it in the last bit. Russia does not bring a lot of money to the region, and this has been kind of the vexing delta in our assessment of Russia's capabilities, or Russia's means, and what it's capable of achieving. It has been punching above its weight in terms of economics since the beginning, and it has deliberately lowballed what it's doing in the region. Yet it's managed to parlay what it has brought into a sense, at least a sense, that Russia is an important player that needs to be consulted. So take a good example. I think you raised it in your paper, Mark, which is the PMTO, or the Naval Logistics Facility in Sudan. I mean, this is a small bore thing. It's been a while in the baking. It's capped at 300 personnel, and yet it's served for big headlines. The Russians and their propaganda are very good about hyping the importance of Russia's footprint here and there. They have clearly made an impact in Libya for better or for worse, and potentially have not gained nearly as much as they wanted to get in Libya. They might envision, for instance, at the end of all this, getting a permanent naval presence there in the Eastern Mediterranean along the Libyan coast. But that's not anywhere in the near term, and in a way, it doesn't really matter to them. They find it more important to get their footprint there and then see what they can get out of this. Over the long term, this may pay some dividends, just as in Sudan. So this is the big limitation that will cause Russia to fall behind U.S. investments, European investments, and even Chinese investments in the region as they come in. Russia continues to star at providing low-level security assistance to specific clients, as we've seen in Libya with the presence of Wagner, the PMC there. And it has worked pretty well. It also hasn't overextended the Russian budget, which is something that people watch very closely. But that delta, that discrepancy between means and ends, is still going to be the long-term problem for Russia.
Great, thank you. And in fact, speaking of Sudan, I know there was reporting yesterday that that agreement might actually be on hold, or at least until the Sudanese legislature can approve of it. But it was curious that something that was seen to be a done deal is perhaps not so done after all. Anyway, turning to Laura, to the degree that there are limitations on what Russia can accomplish in the Mediterranean, to what extent can the US adopt a policy of masterful indifference to what Moscow is doing there and focus on higher priority concerns, such as what China is doing in Asia? And to what extent must the US actively counter Russian policy toward the Mediterranean for fear that what it might accomplish otherwise if we don't?
Thanks, Mark. I think actually in your paper you were advocating for something that I found very sensible, which is, I don't think you described it as a middle path, but between those two extremes of turning everything into a Russia problem in the Middle East and turning a blind eye to the destabilizing behavior that Russia is fomenting in the region. We really do have to walk that middle ground, I think, and have a very balanced and tailored approach. The approach has to focus on specific behaviors by Russia in terms of when we want to push back or impose costs, but it also has to look very specifically at the specific needs and goals of our allies and partners, and have tailored approaches to security cooperation. The other thing that I think, Chris's comment kind of highlights is how good Russia has been at touting these very minor deployments and these minor investments as though they represented a geostrategic success. And I think, our approach has been, relatively quiet, but steady across decades. I mean, if you look at the military presence, the U.S. military presence in the Mediterranean, we've been there for decades. We will, continue to be a strong presence in the Mediterranean, and that is something that perhaps we take for granted, but it's an important source of our ability to, protect our national security interests, but also to cooperate as part of the NATO alliance. The other piece that, U.S. investments, civilian investments in humanitarian assistance in the region completely dwarf anything that Russia is bringing to the table. Their investments are essentially, to line the pockets of cronies back in the Kremlin, more so than they are to actually, benefit the people of the region. I think you see this, in Syria in particular, where the United States has been, working with the United Nations and has been trying to invest, and Russia has been trying to get everybody else to pay for reconstruction rather than doing it themselves. And I think, back to this point about values, Chris described Russian foreign policy, as interest-based and, essentially devoid of values. The U.S. is going to continue to adopt this values-based approach in the region, and it has served us well in the past, and I think it will continue to serve us well in the future.
Great, thank you. Yes, and just carrying on from that, what I hope that the U.S. can and will do is to do what Russia can't or won't, and that is to actually help negotiate real conflict resolution agreements between adversaries, something that Russia seems to want to keep them going. And I think that's one of the great achievements of American diplomacy that we've seen in the Middle East, and I hope that that's going to continue. In any event, we now can turn to questions from the audience, and they have been building up. If you'd like to pose a question, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will now turn to some of these. And we have one from Danila Galperovich, whom I know from the Voice of America Russia service. Israel was able to some extent be friendly with Moscow while still stay allied to the USA. What is the role of Israel in this time of raising tensions between Washington and Moscow? And I should have specified. Maybe we should go in the same order. Chris, would you like to say something about that?
What is the role of Israel I think, I'm not an Israel specialist, but I think Israel's been playing a role that advances Israel's interests. And again, this goes back to what I was saying before about Israel probably uses Russia to, advance its goals in Syria, which, are to reduce the influence of Iran. That's pretty basic, and Russia can actually bring something to the table there. So in this sense, both parties use each other. Russia likes the optic of being able to, deal on a friendly basis with Israel, and cast that as part of its power projection. So I think, and I think that there's no lack of understanding of what Israel wants to accomplish on our part, but I'd leave that for Laura.
Laura, would you care to add something to that?
Sure. I want to kind of foot stomp this notion that what you're seeing between Israel and Russia is partially for optics on the part of Russia, and relatively transactional based on a specific set of facts on the ground related to Iranian presence in Syria and Israel's very understandable need to protect and defend itself. And what the U.S. has with Israel is profoundly different, and again, goes back decades and involves a relationship that is complex and multi-layered and covers pretty much every aspect of what the Department of Defense does in terms of our bilateral military to military relationship in support of Israel's security. So I think, it's really important for us not to take these superficial reports of, meetings in Moscow or, dialogue and misinterpret them for something that is more lasting or strategic.
Very good. We have a question from Benjamin Fishman, a follow-up on Libya. AFRICOM, as mentioned, shined a light on Russian and Wagner activity, but that stopped last summer. Why? And General Townsend said in recent testimony, Wagner's presence in Libya was trending in the right direction. Does that mean we are giving them a chance to withdraw quietly, or are we still skeptical they will follow through? Maybe Chris could talk about that?
Or maybe Laura can talk about that since she's in DOD.
Yeah, so I can definitely touch on this. So, it's funny, the other day I got a similar question in terms of Ukraine. And the question was, well, okay, there's been this announcement and, we see some forces moving. So, is the crisis over? And, my answer is very similar to what I would say about Libya. We're watching very closely. And we absolutely expect, in the case of Ukraine, which is much more dramatic and a significant buildup of forces on the part of Russia. So I'm not equating the two in any way other than to say that we have to be vigilant and we have to be watchful. And we cannot take statements at face value. In the case of Libya, we continue to watch. We continue to, to speak in terms of the absolute necessity for all foreign forces to withdraw, which is what the international agreement is at this point. And we will be prepared to continue to apply pressure if that does not happen.
Great, thank you very much. Maureen Quinn has a question. What are Russia's policies and goals regarding ownership and development of natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean? How does it advance its interests related to natural gas while managing its relationships with countries in the region? This is a very interesting question because Russia wants to invest. It's also a competitor, has and it's a supplier. It has sort of multiple relationships that it's trying to juggle. So who would like to tackle that? Okay, Chris.
Yeah, energy is obviously fundamental to Russia's presence in that part of the world, as it is in primarily in that part of the world. I agree with the question. I think Russia wants to leverage those interests in behalf of its state companies. State companies are the cornerstone of Putin's regime. And again, this is one of those things that is purely interest based. From Russia's point of view, their level of interest, not so much in the eastern part, but a lot in Algeria and in the western part of the Mediterranean, have been sort of fundamental to its energy picture. So. One of the reasons why Russia wants, a permanent presence there in Syria and potentially in Libya, and why it has focused so much attention on Algeria, is precisely because it wants to protect those energy delivery routes and infrastructure. So this is part and parcel of advancing Russia's interests, and I think that is actually part of their long-term strategy.
Very good. It's a question from John Nomikos, hope I'm pronouncing that right, Director of Research Institute for European and American Studies. He has a question for Laura. Russian intelligence operations via the GRU, that's Russian military intelligence, has been increased in the Balkan and Mediterranean region via cultural and religious and educational programs. Is this a concern for US foreign policy in the Eastern Med? Turkey hosts jihadi and terrorist networks under Erdogan's guidance. Is it a problem for a NATO country which destabilizes transatlantic security in our region. And so I guess there's sort of a presumption that this is indeed happening. Laura, would you care to answer that?
I can take a stab at that. I think there's two different aspects to this question, and the first aspect relates to not just the GRU, but really Russia's use of a variety of threat networks to influence foreign governments, to influence, in some cases, it might be influencing economic transactions, and to, in some cases, create sources of instability or, heighten tensions within a particular country or society. And we have certainly seen this as John mentions in the Balkans, but we've also seen this in other places around the world. And the range of actors that can serve as agents of this this Russian malign influence are really widely varied. But at the extreme end, what you can see with these operations are really dramatic and destabilizing outcomes. I mean, I would cite the attempted coup attempt in Montenegro, for example. So certainly this is something that we watch very closely. I think the case of Turkey is a bit of a different case, and I think John was pointing to a different set of sources of stability concerns. But the thread I would tie across kind of both case sets that also applies to other countries in the Mediterranean is our work to partner with these governments, with our allies, to understand the threat environment, to share insights about the threat environment, something that we do especially openly with our NATO allies, to include Turkey, so that there is this shared understanding of transnational threats. And then we partner with our allies and our partners to be able to build their resilience. I'm most familiar with this in the case of the Balkans, because I do work very closely with those countries in my particular portfolio. And I can say that we're engaged in helping these countries, these allies and partners, build their institutions so that they will be resilient against a whole range of outside influence actors and threat actors.
Thank you. We have a question from my old friend Henri Barkey of Lehigh University in the Council on Foreign Relations, which I'd like to direct to Chris. How long can Russia sustain its policy in Syria, especially if, for some reason, things get worse in that country? Do we know the costs to Moscow of its Syrian adventure?
Do we know the costs? We don't have a precise dollar figure. But we think it is not especially extravagant. I'm not sure that we go as far as, buying into what Putin said, which is that the cost of operations in Syria is tantamount to what's built into exercises, normal pace of exercises in Russia. It has not overextended itself in Syria as far as I can tell. But here's kind of the important thing. Overextension is in the eyes of the beholder. And in this case, what I think is most interesting is how the operation in Syria is perceived inside Russia. It is not seen as a popular or necessary exercise in Russian power. Russians don't, understand or care much about, the balance of power in Syria. Russia's attempts to, bring peace settlements, either, through the Astana process, have, led us to, where we are. basically comes down to how much Russia can encourage Turkey to cooperate in Idlib, and how much Russia can encourage the United States to withdraw its presence from northeast Syria. So far, not as much as Russia would like. So it's in this for the long term. Has not, as I said earlier, produced a peace settlement. Russians themselves are not interested. So the fact that Russia's only spending maybe a couple billion a year may not matter. It's just it may be the simple image or impression that Russia's overcommitted to a faraway region that is not really necessarily deeply in Russia's interests. So that's going to be the long-term problem again.
Very good. Following up on this is a question from Adam Blanco. Russian and Iranian interests are currently aligned in Syria. Is this alignment sustainable? And how does Russia's continued presence in Syria impact Iran's aspirations for dominance in the Middle East? And I'm not sure who would like to address that. Perhaps Chris, since you were on this subject.
I'll say something very briefly. It sounds more like a Laura question to me, but I will say that Russia's alliance with Iran is another one of those alliances of convenience that there's no reason to believe that this partnership between Russia and Iran goes beyond Russia's, partnership with any other big player in the region. There are points where they converge, especially on, Assad. Assad is their mutual guy in Syria, and that is the biggest point of convergence. There are points of divergence. We mentioned them before, namely Israel has competing interests. So this is a limited partnership. This is an interest-based limited partnership. But the thing that we shouldn't discount, on the other hand, is their ability to work through problems when they do arise. One of the determining factors there is just simply geography. These are countries that are, forced by geography to have to live with each other and find a common language.
Very good. Laura, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I can just comment a little bit, because one of the points that I sort of touched on earlier, I think is relevant here when you think about Russia's desire to, develop these relationships with everyone in the region. It's not just about Israel, it's also all of the Arab countries. And you do see this growing outreach on the part of Russia. Now, most of it is arms sales. Most of it is in order to, extend the influence of Russia's weapons manufacturers. But more broadly, to the extent that Russia keeps, trying to engage Arab nations, I think you will see that Iran and the relationship with Iran, could be a liability for Russia. And I think you already see that in the Syria context a bit, where Russia is put in this position of wanting to constrain Iran's more aggressive behavior against Israel, because it creates an inconvenience in Russia's relationship. But I think you could definitely see this growing as the two countries are essentially vying for influence in Syria.
Very good. We have a question from another one of my old friends, Edward Salazar. Lavrov's recent visit to Cairo, coupled with the announcement of new Russian-financed nuclear power and industrial projects in Egypt, resumption of air travel, and according to some reports, large expansion of Russian presence there, suggests larger regional ambitions. Would you agree? And perhaps, Laura, maybe you could respond to this first.
Well, I think, all of these really do kind of represent it's the deal of the day with Russia. So, they are trying to make these deals to create inroads for Russian, economic interests, but also political interests. And I think I would see this outreach as consistent with this larger pattern of deal making, again, kind of transactional focus here across the entire region.
Very good. Okay. We have a question from Jason Pack, who is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute and president of Libya Analysis, LLC. Following up on Ben Fishman's question, how do we see Russia using its influence in Libya, which has declined since Haftar's loss and Akila Saleh's failed LPDF campaign is actually promoting its larger Eastern Mediterranean objectives rather than just optics? What Jason sees is just a desire to destabilize and keep the region chaotic rather than a coherent pursuit of specific interests. Chris, would you care to tackle that?
Well, I think, I would not necessarily subscribe to the idea that Russia is just seeking chaos in Libya. I think there is a goal to all this at the end, which is not mere chaos. It's they want something out of this. They haven't articulated exactly what they need or want. A presence there, energy infrastructure, and they can get that in any of a variety of ways. It could be with GNA, it could be with the LNA, it could be with the GNU construction. They have played all sides of the game there. They supported the GNA while also sending forces to help Haftar. As Haftar's lot in life declined, or his stakes declined, Russia started shifting its support. This is in my view, it's not just for chaos. It's trying out what works and seeing how far they can get with it.
Very good. Now, I usually write on Russia and the Middle East, not so much on Russia and Europe. And I realize that what I've done here is to focus, pick questions more on Russia and the Middle East. And so I'd like to turn back to one on Russia and Europe, perhaps for Laura. This one is from Evans Grant in London, former UK Customs Service intelligence analyst for Balkans and ex-Soviet states. How is the US finding the response by the non-military, non-NATO elements of EU governments and the EU central bodies to growing Russian presence and influence, that Evan fears that they are leaving far too much to the USA?
That is such a great question. If you had asked me that question a few years ago, I probably would have expressed a real sense of concern about the lack of focus and attention. But from where I sit today at this time frame, I've actually been really encouraged at what I'm seeing out of the EU. One example is in the realm of the information space and countering Russian disinformation. I've actually seen some really useful and helpful work coming out of the EU on this. Certainly we have initiatives in NATO, certainly, individual, member states and the United States have our own work on countering Russian disinformation, but we have learned from the EU's efforts, and I think that's pretty significant, actually. I would also cite, the recent strength that we've seen coming out of the EU in terms of applying sanctions on Russia. The U.S. sanctions against Navalny, and not against Navalny, obviously, against Russia for the poisoning of Navalny with nerve agent. Those sanctions actually were timed to coincide with sanctions that the EU was moving forward on. I think this is just a wonderfully welcome development that not only is the EU showing a lot of leadership here, the United States is able to actually partner with the EU in doing joint action to push back on Russia's destabilizing actions.
Very good. I have a question from O.D. Mayer for both panelists. How do you see Russian attempts to warm up to the Gulf states, like China is doing, with the seemingly colder line taken by the Biden administration to this area? And I think what he's referring to is we've referred to this before, the Biden administration's emphasis on values, which might not be shared by some of our allies as much as we would like, as opposed to both Russia and China as an interest-based approach. So whoever would like to go first?
Well, I'd be happy to touch on this. Yes, the Biden administration does have a focus on advancing U.S. values in its foreign policy. I think that in the case of the Middle East in general, you see this manifesting in multiple areas. We also have a focus on supporting our partners' security needs. And in the case of Iran and its destabilizing activities, its attack on our partners, including Saudi Arabia, you absolutely have a strong U.S. commitment to support the defense of Saudi Arabia. And that's where I would, pivot to Russia's approach, which really is very transactional and arms sales focused, whereas Russia is looking at the next deal, the next S-400 it can roll off the line, the next S-300 it can roll off the line. The U.S. is involved with its partners in full-scale security institution building programs that look comprehensively at how to address the very complex threat that's coming from Iran in multiple domains with multiple kinds of capabilities.
Chris, did you want to add anything to that?
I'd just say, actually, getting back to what was in your wonderful paper, Russia moves in where it sees a vacuum and where it believes the United States has lowered its profile. I was impressed by the extent to which Russia was able several years ago to reverse this multi-year trend of alienation from the Sunni states, from the Gulf states, and from Saudi Arabia in particular. Now, as Laura said, and as you said, there are just limitations on that. There's only so far you can go with that. You're still playing all the partners against each other. You're still in it, for these transactional deals, as Laura said. So when the Russians believe that we have spoiled relations with the Saudi leadership, you'll see them move in very opportunistically, and it's not nothing. It's as I said at the beginning, we discount Russia's influence and its impact at our peril, but we're all clear-eyed. There are very important limitations on how far Russia can go with this.
Very good. Danila Gelperovich from the Voice of America has a follow-up question. We were talking about the Russian-Israeli relationship. Danila asks, what does the U.S. want from Israel with regard to this situation? In other words, that I think I've been on Israeli-American dialogues in which it's been argued very strongly from the Israeli side that obviously Israel is closer to the United States, but that Israel has very little choice but to cooperate with Russia with regard to Syria, and that Russia has been very helpful in terms of being understanding, shall we say, of Israeli attacks on Iranian Hezbollah targets. And I'm not sure, and I think that there's some, there's obviously, there's merit to this, but is there a point that we are uncomfortable with the degree to which Israel is cooperating with Russia? And whoever would like to answer that first.
So I would just answer quite simply that we have an incredibly close relationship with Israel and very transparent dialogue with Israel on the full range of issues, to include security in Syria, and obviously the Russia dimension of that. So we're comfortable with our our relationship and our ability to be transparent. And that's really what we seek with all of the allies and partners who are also talking to Russia and working with Russia. It's that focus on transparency in the bilateral relationship.
Mm-hmm. Chris, did you want to add to that at all?
No, it's kind of a policy question, so
okay. Alrighty, very good. Excellent. Okay, we have a question from John Grady of USNI News. Is Russia's naval operations in the Mediterranean growing, showing the flag, port visits now, or is the Kremlin more concentrating these operations in the Black Sea to keep pressure on Ukraine? Maybe Chris, you could talk about that.
Yeah, or maybe Laura knows more, but I think is it increasing? I mean, it's increasing over time. Yes, it is. Since 2013, when the Syria conflict was, was 2 years in already. Russia has placed more emphasis on its naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, and and I think that is what feeds its interest in places like Libya and elsewhere in the region. It is to expand a naval presence. It knows. I mean, Russia's goal is to be a great power. This is a world power, and a world power needs a great navy. There are, from my reading, a real emphasis that Putin is placing on developing his naval presence, not just in the Mediterranean, but in the Pacific as well, and elsewhere around the world. Now, it's easier said than done, but I think this is a priority for him.
Very good. I have a question for Laura. You referred to the U.S. obviously was very unhappy about Turkish purchases of the S-400s, and this has impacted the sale of U.S. F-35s, and obviously there was the Biden administration statement about the Armenian genocide, certainly reflects American values. But what we're seeing is that, while we're very concerned about Russian-Turkish cooperation, we're also seeing instances of Russian-Turkish tension that, instead of just being able to divide the spoils, especially with Turkish assistance to Ukraine in particular. I have a feeling that this is something of a red line for Moscow. I think the Russians were surprised at just how much Turkey was able to help Azerbaijan in this conflict with Armenia this past year. I think we've also seen that, I think the Russians were a little surprised at how the Turks came out swinging in Western Libya to push back Haftar's forces. In other words, that there are sources of tensions. And so I'm just wondering, is this the moment to press Turkey on our differences with Turkey, or should we, in fact, are we better off letting Russian-Turkish or encouraging Russian-Turkish relations to deteriorate? In other words, does our pressure on Turkey keep Russian-Turkish relations going stronger than they might ordinarily be if we hadn't been doing so?
Thanks. I think that we have to assume that Turkish foreign policy is based on a whole host of factors, and its relationship with the United States is just one of those factors, and its relationship with Russia is just one of those factors. So I don't want to overplay those two things, but the sources of tension that you cite between Russia and Turkey are real, and they're historical, of course. They go back, decades, and you could argue centuries. So right now, the U.S. is really focused on maintaining our strong alliance relationship with Turkey. Yes, the S-400 was a very difficult episode, but Turkey is still a strong member of NATO, and Turkey still provides, hosts U.S. forces on Turkish soil. Turkey still contributes to NATO operations, shoulder to shoulder with U.S. forces. And we will continue all of those efforts, and we will, redouble our focus on that very strong alliance relationship. And at the same time, I would absolutely agree that the security situation in the broader region and Russia's destabilizing role in that security situation will continue to be an area of both U.S. and concern by Turkey. I do think it's good to focus on the Caucasus region in particular. The fact that at the end of the conflict this fall, you now have Russian peacekeepers on, so-called peacekeepers on Azerbaijan soil. This is a major development, and certainly one that we're not the only ones watching it. Turkey is watching it very closely.
Very good. And we have a question from Christopher Woody for you, Laura. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter is deployed to Europe, where it recently exercised with Mediterranean nation navies and sailed into the Black Sea. And he asks, what does DoD see the Coast Guard is able to do in the region that the U.S. Navy can't do?
Thank you. So now you can hear me, right? Yes. Okay. So this Coast Guard deployment into the Black Sea really is emblematic of our presence in the Black Sea. We and our NATO allies are routinely sending ships into the Black Sea and participating in cooperative exercises. In the case of the Coast Guard, we particularly appreciate the Coast Guard's ability to cooperate with other equivalent services, other Coast Guards in countries really around the world, but in this case, in the Black Sea.
Right. Very good. Okay. We have a question from Carol Gerbin, and I'm terribly sorry if I'm mispronouncing this. And I think this one is for Chris. How important is it for Russia to have a foot in Montenegro? There was reference, earlier to the coup attempt there, which would sort of, once it fails and Russia's footprints are on it, that wouldn't really be very helpful to Russia and Montenegrin relations. But anyway, but how important do you see Montenegro to Russia, Chris?
I think Montenegro is relatively unimportant to Russia, except as a card, a chit in Europe. Okay, Russia went very far to try to prevent Montenegro from joining the alliance. In this case, what Russia was most motivated by was Montenegro's aspirations to join NATO. Russia obviously has a lot of oligarch interests in Montenegro, and so it's important for Oleg Deripaska and some other wealthy Russians who have a presence in Montenegro. But for Russia, they tend to see places like Montenegro within the context of this larger geopolitical game. Once a country is in NATO, it's protected by the NATO umbrella. It never stops being a target for Russian influence, for Russian money, but it becomes, in my view, less of a target for more serious destabilization.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Stan Weinstein. I think we'll direct this toward Laura. What will our exit from Afghanistan and our negotiating directly with the Taliban, while, Stan says, ignoring the elected government, mean to Russia's ability to magnify its influence? So there's an assumption that we are ignoring the Afghan government, but then there's a question of what we're doing in Afghanistan mean for Russian influence? I would, perhaps both in Afghanistan and more broadly.
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily agree with the characterization of how we're engaging in discussions with the Afghan government. But I would say that, over time, we have seen, a less than totally constructive role on the part of Russia in these negotiations to solidify a peaceful Afghanistan with a stable government. We are hoping that Russia will decide that it can work cooperatively with all the countries in the region to support a more stable government. Certainly, Russia does have interests that relate to the region, relate to the presence of Al Qaeda, of ISIS. Russia does not want terrorists to transit into the Russian Federation. That said, I think at this point, this is in the realm of diplomatic dialogue and not in the realm of specific concrete results.
Thank you. And I'd just like to point out that I had an article in the National Interest last week in which I argued that if indeed the U.S. leaves Afghanistan and if things really go worst case situation and the Taliban start supporting jihadists, that as embarrassing as this will be for the US, it's going to be far worse for Afghanistan's immediate neighbors and for Russia. And that's terribly, terribly sad. Anyway, one question I guess I have for you, Laura, is that, in my issue brief, one of the things that I pointed out that one reason it seems to me that some of our allies are at least working with the Russians to some extent is that for unfortunately too many of our allies, they seem to be more concerned about certain other states than they are about Russia. In other words, we have certain allies that are far more worried about Iran than about Russia, and we have certain allies that are more worried about Turkey than Russia. And of course, I think Turkey, in some senses, is more worried about some of our other allies in the region than about Russia. Now, I think that the purpose of America's alliance relationships has always been to protect our allies against external threats. But one of the other purposes, it seems to me, is that America's alliance relationships has been to tamp down the tendency for conflict toward or among America's allies. There's a famous, NATO first Secretary General who said, the purpose of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Very unfortunate. But what it does seem to me is that what it captures is that our multilateral alliances do serve a function of keeping the tendency toward conflict that might exist among our allies at bay, and that there seems to be an unfortunate tendency at present for some of our allies to be focusing more on their disputes with one another. And I'm just sort of wondering, in other words, how you view that and how can we overcome that?
Well, honestly, I mean, from where I'm sitting in the Pentagon, working through, the NATO alliance, building these bilateral relationships, of course, there are always frictions between countries, to include those that are part of NATO, bilateral frictions. But I can't say that I have seen anything that is impacting our ability as an alliance to function, or impacting actual security concerns in the region. So I think that our ability to focus on shared security concerns, shared interests, and shared values actually has been able to transcend that. Although I absolutely acknowledge there are these concerns, there are these frictions, and when there are, we hope that the United States, with our NATO allies, are the first to be facilitating, dialogue to reach agreements and overcome these differences.
Right. In my view, one of the unfortunate results of perhaps a previous administration's policy of casting doubt on America's commitment to its allies is that one of the outcomes is that the allies, in other words, that these potential disputes sort of rose up, and that I think one of the thing about asserting our commitment to our alliance relationships is that hopefully tamps down this possibility. Okay, we have a question from, and I'm sorry, I'm going to mangle this name, Ertan Monsiali. Uh, will the US continue to support, um, well, essentially Syrian Kurds, in other words, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the YPG, and the questioner also includes the PKK, in other words, that in Syria in the following years. Even though the US recognizes PKK as a terrorist organization and knows that the PKK, YPG, and SDF are the same organization. So I guess my question is that do we in fact know that? But it is an interesting question about, in other words, what will be our continuing relationship with various Syrian Kurdish forces?
So the SDF have been our partners in the fight against ISIS, and that is true today as well. And we will continue to be, working to defeat ISIS in a permanent way. Not just in Syria, but this is obviously a broader global challenge. In terms of Turkey, we have been very clear in our bilateral dialogue with Turkey that we recognize their very legitimate security interests, to include border security interests, and we will continue to have that dialogue with Turkey.
Very good. There's a question from my colleague at George Mason University, Heba El-Shazli, professor there, and I'll direct this to Chris. Do you think that Russian public opinion could have an impact on Russia being in Syria or other conflict areas in the Middle East, North Africa region when their sons do not come home? Could it curtail Russia's support, participation in conflicts in the region? What can we do to highlight this aspect to put pressure on Russia's foreign adventures or misadventures? And I would just add, sort of the dimension of the Muslim population in Russia. So, Chris, if you could tackle that, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, I sort of touched on this before, but I think it is an interesting question, because the Russian people, don't see deep interests for themselves in this part of the world. It's fine for them when state TV can highlight, precision bombing strikes on supposed ISIS targets. That looks good on the nightly news, but Russian people are not, by and large, energized or mobilized by Russia's activities in Syria or elsewhere in the Middle East. So you've seen this effort going on largely without a lot of spotlighting from Russian media. It was interesting when this is a sensitive issue, we think, for the Kremlin. Noticed that when had this civilian airliner from Kogalim Avia shot down over the Sinai, Russia did not attribute it to terrorism. It was not until the terrorist attacks in Paris, a week and a half later, that the Russians finally said, "Oh, you know what? This airliner was shot down, was taken down by terrorists." They were very deliberate in avoiding any association of their activity in that part of the world with bringing terrorist attacks to their own people, and they've done this repeatedly. I mean, how many times now has President Putin announced the withdrawal from Syria? I think it's 3 times now, and they're still there. So he has been careful not to put, uniformed servicemen in harm's way. He knows that this is a vulnerability. It's what helped bring about, the end of the Soviet Union, although the involvement in Afghanistan was at much greater scale. and it was more intense. So he knows the vulnerabilities and has been careful to avoid them. The uh, that's the area in which the Russian state interests and state media operate, and they've been very careful to not let the wider public really focus on those vulnerabilities.
Interesting. Very good. Thank you. I have a question for you, Chris. Now, in my report, I talked about how Russian activity in the Mediterranean region is obviously has a anti-American, in other words, competition with the United States element about it. But I'm just wondering, to what extent do you see what Russia is doing in this region as in anticipation of a rising China? We've seen Chinese influence growing, in the Red Sea, in the Gulf, and there's sort of a trend here that sort of growing outward. Do you see the Russians as being concerned with China? And there have been several reports about not only China's growing relations in the Mediterranean region, but even in the Black Sea, that they're involved. And of course, they bring something that Russia doesn't bring, and that's lots of money. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Is Russia concerned about China in this part of the world? I think, I think Russia at a certain level, probably just below the senior leadership levels, there is definitely concern about China's growing presence, everywhere, and everywhere where Russia has traditionally played a role. They're aware that China is increasingly playing a role, and as you said, China brings to the table that which Russia cannot, which is money and infrastructure. And I don't think Russia has really focused yet on China's presence necessarily here. I think they're aware of it and probably wary of it. They're focused much more on its presence in other areas like Central Asia, perhaps in Vietnam. But to say that they don't recognize this as a long-term problem to deal with, I think would be an exaggeration. In the meantime, there are no significant, there's no significant strife that's engendered by China's presence in Greece or other places in the Mediterranean. But the problems, any problems between Russia and China are for now workable. The leaders have a good understanding. They are able to work through potential competition. But this, as many people have noted, is going to be a problem perhaps for the next generation of Russia's leaders.
Very good. Laura, I have a question for you. Those of us who are old enough to remember the Cold War, one of the things we saw in the early 1970s was that the progress on Soviet American arms control ended up being interrupted by Soviet behavior in regional conflicts, whether Angola, the Horn of Africa, and of course the main one, Afghanistan. Now, of course, we see there has been the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that Biden administration is hoping to revive this, but just as we saw back in the 1970s, obviously in this case, Iran is involved in regional conflicts, whether in Syria, also it has a role in Iraq, in Yemen, elsewhere. And I'm just wondering, in other words, is this a total obstacle, in other words, or can we compartmentalize our policy and pursue nuclear arms control on the one hand and yet sort of compete on the other? Or is it a non-starter. And the thing is about, back in the 1970s, the one thing that changed, of course, was that in the 1980s, under Gorbachev, the Soviets reversed their position on regional conflicts, and this enabled, resumed progress toward arms control. Are we going to have to wait for this with regard to Iran? There was some dramatic change inside Iran, which may or may not happen anytime soon, or can we, in fact, sort of pursue the JCPOA while at the same time somehow reacting to Iran on a regional basis, or is this just going to be an obstacle?
Okay, so I can address the Iran piece at a general level because I'm not an Iran expert, and obviously the State Department is leading these discussions right now. So this is kind of unfolding as we speak. But I think the bilateral U.S.-Russia relationship is also quite instructive in terms of the philosophy here, because what you're asking about more broadly is how you can hold a destabilizing actor to account, even as you are engaged in dialogue to frame out arms control agreements. And I think it's a resounding yes in terms of the administration's approach to continue to pursue dialogue related to arms control, whether you're talking about Iran or you're talking about Russia. And in the specifics of JCPOA, this is one area where we are still hopeful that Russia will play a constructive role. At the end of the day, Russia, we talked about Russia's interest in preventing terrorism. Russia does also have an interest in non-proliferation, and we are hopeful that that they can be a useful part of this. Separately, on the bilateral track, we very much are pursuing not just holding Russia to account for destabilizing actions, like I mentioned earlier, the Novichok use and election interference and solar winds, those types of things. But at the same time, pursuing the potential for a strategic stability dialogue with Russia and looking at the early renewal of the New START agreement, and not taking that as the end accomplishment, but rather the beginning of a process that can lead to further progress on arms control.
Very good. Laura, your mention of the Russian interest in non-proliferation with regard to Iran is quite interesting. And that brings me up to a piece I had published with the Atlantic Council yesterday in reaction to the audio tape leak of Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, in which one of the things he said that back in 2015, when the JCPOA was being negotiated, that his rival, the general head of the Quds force of Iran, Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards, was in Moscow, and that the Russians were trying to undermine the signing of the JCPOA. That they were fearful at the time that an agreement on JCPOA would lead to a broader Iranian-American relationship, and that certainly my conversations with Russians is that this is the far worse case for Russia than even a nuclear Iran. And Chris, I don't know if you can respond to that briefly in just a moment, because we have to wrap up here pretty soon.
Russia likes to play, all sides and see what it can get out of its relationships. That said, I agree with what Laura was saying about Russia's, positive role, or hopes for a continued positive role in Iran negotiations on JCPOA. So, the two are not incompatible. They
Okay.
actually can coexist.
Laura, you have a quick final word on that, or anything else?
I think it's excellent to conclude on the wisdom of Chris Bort, and I'm delighted that he joined me here today. Thank you.
Okay, well, in that case, it falls to me to bring this very interesting session to a conclusion, I would like to thank very much Christopher Bort, National Intelligence Officer for Russia at the National Intelligence Council, Laura Cooper, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, Eurasia at the Department of Defense. Thank you for this very, very interesting session. Thank you to the audience for submitting so many fascinating questions. And I want to thank everyone for participating and hope that you'll all have a look at this report of mine, Putin's Mediterranean Gambit, Endgame, Unclear, which you can download for free from the Atlantic Council's website. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you, Mark.